you write that perhaps the Labour Together project's most consequential intervention was to insert itself into the high-profile Labour Party anti-Semitism crisis that embroiled the Corbyn leadership from 2018. Further investigation is needed to establish the full extent of the project's involvement in what became a protracted national controversy, but there is now little doubt that its role was profound, wide-ranging, and at times despicable. So what was the role of the Labour Together project in the anti-Semitism crisis? Because there's stuff which emerged in, the leak report that we covered as part of Novara Media, Al Jazeera's The Labour Files as well. Obviously has a lot of material about the ways in which investigations were sort of slowed down or sped up, depending on what served the best political function. But what else was going on behind the scenes?
And there's effectively two things that the Labour Together project is doing at that time. And to be very specific, the Labour Together project at that time involves Morgan McSweeney, Steve Reed to a lesser extent, although he is involved and seems to be knowledgeable of some of it, and a guy called Imran Ahmed. Now, Imran Ahmed is a Labour Party insider. He's been working for the Labour Party for since 2010 up until 2017. Like Morgan McSweeney, he's on the right of the party, or certainly not pro the Corbyn faction of the party.
Used to work for Angela Eagle.
In which role he was, behind this very fierce bureaucratic fight back in her constituency against a very powerful emergent left wing. Because obviously in places like Liverpool, where the Jeremy Corbyn surge is so big, so profound, that you suddenly have this very realistic possibility that people like Angela Eagle could be deselected, right? There could be a newly elected MP in that constituency, and he is involved behind the scenes and a very nitty gritty blood sport level in making sure that she survives that challenge, right? And that involves lots of bureaucratic machinations. He's also at the time working to sort of try and get local, quite small independent journalists suspended or expelled from the party for reporting in ways that are not helpful to his political ambitions or Angela Eagle's political ambitions. So those are the three people who make up that Labour Together project. And it's not entirely clear when Imran Ahmed joins the scheme. It's late 2017, early 2018. And there's two strands to it. The primary strand to begin with is they're working to place stories in the media without any disclosure that they're involved in it. And the first big story that we know about is the story that breaks in the Sunday Times. I think it's in April 2018, if I remember correctly, called Corbyn's Hate Factories.
And I remember Corbyn's Hate Factories.
Yeah. And what it is effectively that Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed have joined a whole range of these open public Facebook groups, which have hundreds of thousands of members, and I spent months trawling through all of the comments and the posts to discover anything that's untoward to their minds, that racist, misogynist, anti-Semitic, and they create a dossier of all this stuff. They find within all of the posts on these massive Facebook groups 2,000 posts that they consider to be problematic, and they effectively give this dossier to the Sunday Times, which then writes up this Corbyn's Hate Factory. And the thesis behind that is that there is this world of online, these online hate factories, these industrialized sites of producing hate, in which Corbyn is fundamentally embedded. Corbynism is embedded in this. It reflects the racist, misogynistic, bullying culture of Corbynism itself. But also Corbynism derives its power from these sorts of networks, right? So it's totally tainted by the discovery of the stuff. But of course, none of it, their role was never declared. Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed. Instead, they're written about as whistleblowers. I've always been, why were they whistleblowers? What were they blowing the whistle on exactly? A whistleblower is somebody who works in a company and finds something wrong and then blows the whistle on it. What they were whistleblowers for Facebook? That doesn't make any sense. I don't know why they're called whistleblowers. But be that as may, it's their first sort of foray into the world of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And it's part of creating this narrative that Corbynism is inherently anti-Semitic or inhabits anti-Semitism or is unconcerned with anti-Semitism. The problem is, if you go look at that article again, it's a very difficult article to to describe, because it is this mixture, and it is sort of an expression of the problem of the anti-Semitism crisis, because the anti-Semitism crisis is made up of all sorts of different things. One of which is that there is anti-Semitism in society. There's anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that has to be dealt with. There's also people who are making allegations of anti-Semitism who don't know what they're talking about, right, and make it promiscuously or in an alarmist tone. I think that's the key thing, is it's an alarmist narrative about the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And also there's lots of conduct that's described as anti-Semitic that isn't anti-Semitic. But when people push back on it and say, well, I don't think that is anti-Semitic,
But that's itself anti-Semitic.
Exactly. That's the nihilism. So if you're denying the existence of anti-Semitism because you're saying, I don't think that's anti-Semitic, then you're an anti-Semitic denialist.
And then there's also the context of heightened factional conflict. You know, I mean, I remember how it felt to wake up with like heart palpitations during those years because your fight or flight was just constantly engaged.
Yeah. And it is intense, the extent to which there is a daily scandal and there's a daily discovery that dominates the news. Or even if there's a daily discovery of like a new obscure councillor who said something horrible or marginally horrible on Facebook, there's going to be an MP who says something that then creates its own news cycle. It's basically, it doesn't stop. From 2018 until 2019, it is a daily like whirlwind of like allegation and counter allegation, within which there are serious allegations of anti-Semitism and like total nonsense allegations of anti-Semitism. And the whole way the crisis unfolded meant that couldn't be untangled in a way that is actually helpful to fighting anti-Semitism.
And you also have political operators who
Absolutely.
are journalists, like John Ware, for instance, who I think would be fair to say is a deeply politically motivated guy who was behind the Panorama documentary, of which there have been many, many problems found.
Yeah. And that creates, there is this very one-sided account, I think, of, and this is what Martin Ford says, he talks about John Ware's Panorama documentary. He says, like, the difference between the Panorama documentary and Martin Ford's report into the same sort of material is that Martin Ford says, well, I spoke to both sides and I got both perspectives and I present them both as legitimate perspectives, whereas I think it's a fair criticism to say of the John Ware documentary that you really only get the one perspective primarily, which is a perspective of people, quite a few of whom, or at least one of whom we know, is working with Morgan McSweeney at the time, like on these secret projects, right? He's actually appearing in that documentary. And none of this is known to us at the time, right? We don't know any of this is happening. So that's the other thing that Morgan McSweeney is doing, is in addition to working on these stories that he's placing in the media, and what it seems to me, and it's not entirely, I haven't dug into it as much as I'd like to, but it seems that Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed function as this very useful node of facilitating. There's still people in the Labour Party bureaucracy who who have information about the way the party is dealing with anti-Semitism. And Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed help them navigate the press, basically, and get their stories into the press and make sure certain key stories are definitely told. So certain complaints definitely get national coverage. At the same time, Morgan McSweeney is working with the Jewish Labour movement, who are at that stage considering writing a submission to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. Now, we don't know, the problem that's very frustrating is we don't know the extent of that collaboration. What we do know is that Pogren and Maguire say that McSweeney effectively helped to engineer the EHRC's investigation into the Labour Party, into the way the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn had handled complaints of anti-Semitism.